Hi guys, I hope everybody's doing well. I'm back again.
Hello darkness, my old friend.
It's definitely been a very long time, but I'm done with matric now. I don't have to worry about studying for subjects that I don't really want to study for. So I guess we're back at it. So for today's video, we're going to be looking at weighing and some interesting things about it. I think everybody's being taught weighing and like the different ways of weighing, but I think there's some important aspects to it that don't really get addressed, which this video will address.
Nice.
So onto the video, weighing.
What the hell is even that?
So weighing can be defined as the process of explaining why your argument matters more than your opponent's argument. And what that means is that you're taking two independent arguments made from your side and the other side and assessing their significance separately. So a good intuition pump that I always keep at the back of my head is that if I'm saying, okay, Ronaldo versus Messi, both of those players fulfill different roles in their team. They play different positions at certain times, at certain points in their career, and essentially they're carrying out different tasks in their team. And when you compare them, you're comparing them separately, like who is fulfilling their role much better than the other person, and which role is more significant in a team, kind of thing. There are a few pointers that I always keep though when understanding weighing. The first thing is, at the most basic level, you're taking them at their best case scenario. So when I say basic level, there are other forms of weighing that looks at the other team's truth and the probability of their truth. But at its basic level, you're taking them at their absolute truth and saying, here's why maybe our point is more important than theirs. The other thing that I keep in the back of my mind is that sometimes debates are so contentious that judges may find a hard time in giving the debate to one side or the other because both sides are saying the most absolute correct things, the most logical things, and it's hard to decide which of the impacts that they're discussing is more important. Thus, the last pointer is, when I think about weighing, I'm thinking about when I'm doing the weighing, I'm shifting the debate from being a clash of truth to a prioritization of impacts. Thus, you can see there is a bit of a similarity in everything that I'm saying, and that's just saying here are impacts. Assuming both of them were true, here's why one is more important than the other. So, when should weighing be done? I think there are 4 points to consider when thinking about doing weighing. The first thing is that oftentimes it should be done later in the debate. So you first have to show that the other side is wrong before doing weighing. And I think this is a common mistake most debaters make, right? Because weighing is giving the other side their best case scenario. So if maybe you are a later speaker, in other words, maybe your opposition second or you are third speaker, it's often best to do it then because you don't want to sell away to the judge or adjudicator that the other side is probably cooking, right? You want to show them first that the other side is probably wrong, and then you show why, even if they were correct, here's another reason why we're winning. In other words, their impact isn't as important as yours. The second time when you can do weighing is when you're making arguments or even rebuttal more robust. In other words, you've shown that it's true. You've shown maybe why the other side, in comparison to yours when doing a comparative, as discussed in my previous video, is maybe not as effective as yours, and maybe you have shown us impacts. At the end of all of that, you can add weighing as an additional tool or an additional step to make your argument stronger. The third time, and I think this is something that a lot of people miss, is when the other side is probably speaking the truth and maybe what they're saying is correct. This is the best time to do weighing, right? Because for instance, if another side is probably discussing like economic growth for people in poverty and you have a different impact, and maybe they say something like, look, we're helping people that are in poverty. It's true, some people are in poverty, or sometimes their policy does actually help people in poverty, and that's just the truth. You can't it's like saying poverty doesn't exist. Obviously that's not true. The last time though, and this is one of the more known ways of doing when to do weighing, and that's at the end of a clash. And this is when you take the other side at their best case or their most important impact and you compare it to your most important impact. I think the key takeaway from these 4 pointers is that you do it at the end of something, whether it's at the end of a clash, at the end of a debate, or even at the end of your argument, right? Because you want to sell the other side's case as not being the best yet, right? Or you want to show that there's stepping stones in your case that you needed to get through first. Thus, it is best to always do it at the end of something. How then do we weigh arguments? So this part of the video, I'm going to be looking at how we weigh practical arguments or pragmatic arguments. So these are arguments that explore the effectiveness, benefits, or harms of a motion. And there are generally 6 ways that we can weigh those type of arguments. The first way is exploring the magnitude of an impact. In other words, you're saying here's a benefit from both sides, and which has more depth in that benefit, or which has more depth in that harm, or if it's a benefit versus harm, which of the impacts have more depth. A very good example for this is, let's say one side is arguing about teenagers' academic success when they go to awards or at graduation versus students, let's say mental health, in choosing to be happy and probably not overwork themselves. A very good way up here is saying on the opposition side that we should prioritize the impact of mental health, because the depth of that impact is very intense compared to the benefit of being at a graduation. This is because the effects of harming your mental health can be very debilitating. In other words, that it can carry over for like a long time, or can hurt you much more longer or much more intensely compared to one night of happiness at a graduation evening where you leave high school and that graduation and nobody cares how many A's you got at school. The second way in which you can do weighing is the numbers game. So you're looking at how much an impact, or how much, let's say a policy, for example, affects people and how many of those people are affected. So a good example my coaches used to give me is the more the merrier. And I think a good example for this is if you had an impact and it could help 100 people compared to another side's impact, which is probably better than yours, but it only helps one person, you would rather, take the benefit that helps the 100 people, right? This often comes up in medical debates where, let's say they say a vaccine, you have a vaccine that can fully vaccinate one person, or you have a vaccine and you use that one vaccine on, let's say, 10 people, and even though they aren't all fully cured, at least that now they are all at a better position than they were previously. The third way is the plausibility of an impact. So you might say that an impact is probably very true and very logical, but the other side's living in debate world because the context of the real world probably wouldn't help or have that impact at all. The fourth way is the cost effectiveness of something. So is it actually worth the time and resources, right? So let's say you were studying the night before for an exam, and let's say in your curriculum you had 15 poems to study. Would you rather study those 15 poems, get them over and done with, or would you spend the whole night instead of studying looking at the past 15 years past papers and being like, okay, here's a data set that I've created maybe on ChatGPT. There's an 80% chance of this poem pulling up, 70% chance of this poem pulling up, etc. Going through all that tedious work and boring work when you could have just studied. That's a good example that I always keep at the back of my head when I'm meant to be studying as opposed to guessing what I should be studying. The fifth way that you can weigh is often a very good tool of weighing, and it's assessing the reversibility of an action. This is oftentimes when you're discussing maybe, let's say, a harm, and you want to say, we might need to allow that harm for a short period of time, and we can overcome those harms by reversing it and taking it away, right? Good example is maybe if we're talking about a pandemic and you're like, look, here's the harm of not having money. But we would rather that by lifting some regulations because we want to have economic stimulus, even though some people might get infected in a pandemic. And you would say that it is reversible because it's not that hard maybe to quickly put back a regulation and vaccinate those individuals. The last way is by exploring the time frame that an impact may last. So there are many examples of this where you look at short-term versus long-term, short-term versus short-term, long-term versus long-term. Good example for this is, look, they may have this really nice benefit that like helps a lot of people, but look, it only lasts for a couple of weeks. Whereas the other harm that may come from their side on top of that benefit is this harm X, for example, and it lasts even longer than their benefit. Thus, we don't want their impact anymore because that's just a short-term benefit. There's so many ways you can explore time frames. One key takeaway is that you can even hear in the examples that I'm given that they are very interrelated. In other words, most way-ups use 3 different techniques or tools even in a singular sentence. So it's just about knowing these tools at your disposal and being aware that you probably are even using them, but you aren't realizing that. Now I'm going to explore how we can weigh principal arguments, because these often don't get weighed and principles are often just left up in the air in debates or never touched on again. So I think there are generally 3 ways you can weigh principal arguments. The first way is when you look at the vulnerability of an actor. In other words, you're assessing the need of a stakeholder. So for instance, let's say there are 2 kids that lost $10, right? One of them comes from a much well-off family, and another individual comes from a less privileged family. You would say the actor that's more vulnerable is probably the actor that comes from the less privileged family, because the rich kid can just, get the $10 back, whereas the less privileged kid probably wouldn't. That's probably not the best example in a debate, but that's how I think about vulnerability of actors. The second one is assessing the responsibility and the obligation of an actor. So for example, if we're in a debate about climate change, right, and it's about carbon tax on people, you're like, sure, although having a carbon tax may be beneficial, are the day-to-day individuals, like the average citizens, supposed to be the one that produces the benefits or the reversibility of climate change? Shouldn't it be maybe the government, or shouldn't it be, like corporations, for example, that are producing a lot of carbon emissions in the world? The last way is by looking at the scope of a principle and how applicable it is to multiple contexts. This is a very good way of weighing principles, especially in debates that have to do with a certain virtue. So if one side's arguing the principle of a virtue and the other side's arguing the other side of a virtue or a different virtue that people have to, hold by or stand by, you would say maybe your virtue is much more applicable to a lot of people, or it goes to it doesn't matter the context, that principle always applies to everybody on earth. For example, in debates maybe about success and failure and the virtue of working hard in a specific way, and obviously it would be debate specific, you would definitely ask yourself something about maybe the universal application of that virtue when it comes to success and failure, and how people across the world, maybe how people interact with it at maybe the developing nation versus a developed nation. And for example, maybe in certain countries, maybe your principles about human dignity versus freedom of speech. In some countries, they probably don't value freedom of speech, but they still value something like human dignity. Of course, every example that I've said in this video is maybe not as easy to explain in isolated examples, and they're always going to be debate specific. Now, before I end off the video, I would like to just give you guys some tips when doing weighing. The first thing that I always keep in mind is that weighing does not need congruency like it does with comparatives. If you've watched the comparative video that I've made earlier in the year, I think people should take advantage of this fact, right? Because you don't always have to compare a benefit versus a benefit, or which side is more effective at getting a specific common goal. It's literally saying we are both completely different sides, or both arguing completely different things, but here's why our one is much more important. The other thing is, I think something people struggle with, you can't disprove facts. like earlier on, as I alluded to in the video, if someone's arguing about poverty and what they're saying is true, you would probably know that they're speaking the truth and you can't disprove it, right? Like if, for example, you're in a debate that says this house would ban gambling and the other side says, look, gambling is an addiction. I don't know, like that's true. You can't say it's not, you know what I'm saying? The other thing that I also keep in mind is that if you're losing, this should probably be your first resort. I remember I was losing a quarterfinal, I think last year at Nationals, and I think my team discussed this afterwards that we needed to weigh more, especially at the end, because we were like low-key losing, high-key losing. So I think when you're losing, this should be your first resort, because oftentimes a good indication of why you're losing is that the other team is probably speaking more truth than you are. The next two bullet points are interrelated. If you've been taught any type of indirect response or like an even if response, those can also be used, right? Oftentimes you should trust your intuition because at a certain point you have to let go of the templates that you have. They have to be ingrained in your mind. So any other form of weighing that you may have, because it may be very debate specific, use those as long as you know that you are talking about the prioritization of impacts. In addition to everything, I would like to also point out that almost anything can be weighed. But not everything has to be weighed. So yes, even debatory stuff can be weighed. In other words, maybe you can weigh an argument's quality, you can weigh both sides' context, both sides' framing, which I will also make a video on. But I think almost anything can be weighed, to be honest, even both sides' truth or plausibility, as I've hinted at like the beginning of the video, at the middle part rather. But another key thing to remember though is not everything has to be weighed. There are certain things that can just be disproven, right? And I think we often get used to the fact that as we're growing older and we're getting to the more senior divisions, or for instance, we're competing at higher levels, maybe even at a national level, an international level, oftentimes we forget that we can still disprove things because maybe we're so used to the fact that there are much higher quality arguments being produced, but not everything a smart person says is true. We're all human after all. Sometimes it's just about paying close attention to the finer details of what one team's saying and still disproving that. So that's the video, guys. Thank you so much. I was a bit flustered, out of breath. It's been a long time, but thank you for stopping by, and on to the next one.